Welcome to this week's episode of What's at Stake. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis, a partner here at Penta, and I'm joined today with one of my colleagues, Lauren Wolfson, and a good friend and friend of the pod, Dan Cox. Dan's a pollster and director and founder of the Survey Center on American Life at the American Enterprise Institute. Dan and I go way back, and we've done a lot of work together around the research he looks into on American life, on the intersection of religion, politics, and what we're going to talk about today is generations and the difference between the generations. We're also joined by Kelsey Eyre Hammond, who's Dan's co-author on a lot of the research that just came out from the center on Gen Z. Dan, Kelsey, thank you both for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And Lauren, thank you for jumping in the pilot seat.
Happy to be back.
Love it. So Dan, I want to get into your report in the survey you just released, but I'll start with what piqued my interest and caused me to ask you to come back onto the show again. You wrote a piece for your Substack, American Storylines, I want to say about a month ago. And, it was about this idea, are generational labels meaningless? I think it was Pew that came out and was saying a little bit about, do we really need to focus on all these labels? And we've seen this more and more as a push to abandon how we label different generations. But your piece kind of pushed back on that. And I'd love you to just kind of dive into that and explain your thinking on generational labels.
Sure. And when we talk about generations, we should note that there are a number of ways that different researchers, different polling outfits do this. So if they do have Generation Z and millennial labels in their research, they may not all have the same definition. So it's important just to note that at the outset. We have followed the way Pew does traditionally. So for us, when we're talking about Generation Z, we're talking about people who were born between 1997 and 2012. So the oldest members of the Generation Z cohort are 26. And so in our survey, we talked to people who were between the ages of 18 and 26. And so I think there's no right way to do this kind of research. And one of the things that I wanted to push back on, what we're seeing in the academy, rising criticism of the use of these labels and these categories. And my concern was, well, they are imperfect, but what is the alternative? People are misusing them. If you look at some of the way people are reporting on these groups, the biggest critique, which I think is absolutely valid, is that people are saying, well, you are Generation Z, and you behave this way because you're a member of Generation Z, right? So you're ascribing personality traits to an entire group of people who are quite diverse in many respects. And so I wanted to take it back, sort of say, okay, this is, not really an appropriate way to handle it. And what we mean and what defines generation are shared formative experiences. And in the past, that would be like a major event. So living through the Great Depression, right. Living through 9/11, those kind of seminal experiences that impacted your worldview. And it doesn't have to be, a major national incident like an act of terrorism or an earthquake. It could be something much more mundane, like, changing family structure. So being raised in a divorced household, which is much more common, being raised by two parents who are both in the workforce. These had really formative impacts as well. And it's one of the reasons that I think these generational categories are important.
And first of all, thank you for politely not correcting me. I think I misspoke. It wasn't Pew who came out against the labels. It was someone aiming at Pew for using the labels. But
Pew
we'll do some live
that criticism, and they've adapted, I think, because they received some constructive criticism.
Yeah, fair. So you were starting to say that in many ways the labels are more important or more meaningful than ever. And some of that's, like you said, signature events. But even as we think about, technology and, we've got a Certainly we can talk about the iPhone, and we can talk about even, folks growing up in the school and workforce on laptops. My kids use laptops every day in the classroom. We had literally a computer lab where we got 45 minutes a week to learn on it back when I went to school. But these are big things that do unite kind of a generation and define them. And even as we look forward to like issues like AI, it seems like those are truly important factors that bring this together.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the one thing I didn't mention is technological change. And for folks who study this and believe in the importance of generations, one of the things they really focus on is the fact that the way technology has manifested in our daily lives is completely revolutionizing the way we're operating day to day. And I'll use my own kids as an example. So I have a 5 and a 7-year-old, and they're growing up talking to computers, right? They're talking to Alexa. They're engaging in a way that, no other generation has ever done before. And I think it will just continue to be that we operate that way, that we engage that way. AI is another example. I mean, smartphones, there's been a ton written on smartphones, how that's changing the way we socialize, the amount of time we spend in various social contexts, right? It has had a remarkable impact on our daily lives in ways that are really generationally distinct, right? So if you got a cell phone or a smartphone at the age of 12, that's really different than getting it at 22, at 32. And so that's what we mean when we say that these experiences are unique because of when they occurred.
And how much are you seeing that between adjacent generations? Like, I know you've just released a study on Gen Z. How much either difference or maybe similarity is there between Gen Z and millennials versus, Gen Z and boomers on this count?
Yeah, I think there's, in some ways, on some questions, you see a lot of commonalities. Obviously, millennials and Gen Z are racially, ethnically, religiously much more diverse than older generations. They're much more likely to adopt kind of a pluralistic mindset and embrace differences in ways that older generations are somewhat less likely to. So those kind of things you see probably more commonality, but in other ways you see these generations really distinct. And one of the ways that we saw in that survey was attitudes around gender and feminism, where you see much larger gaps among Gen Z than you do among millennials.
Yeah. Lauren, you've done some research into how Gen Z and millennials kind of view each other. What are you seeing in that research?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of similar things to what Dan and Kelsey have seen too. I think, with any research or any time you're analyzing groups, there's not one group that is monolithic, but I definitely do agree that there are different macro forces that shape the experience of different generations. Anything from big world events, again, to technology is a very big one, especially between millennials and Gen Z. That seems to be the biggest divider. Did you grow up and have social media at school, high school, college, or did you not? Right. And so I think some of the research that we've done actually shows, again, to Dan's point, that there's much more similarities between, let's call it Gen Z and millennials than not. But we have seen a couple of key differences. One is around just how communities are formed. Gen Z, I think millennials are a bit more likely to rely on social media to explore and discover and post and share with communities that they've already formed. Whereas Gen Z, while also doing those things, is much more likely to use social media to convene like-minded communities. So shared passions, shared hobbies, shared interests, finding that space online to express themselves, but also to find like-minded people. And I think that's one key difference that we see. And I think another difference is a lot of millennials' experiences were shaped by the recession and collapse, financial collapse in 2008. And so it's very hard to get a job. You had to present yourself as like, in the best way, quote unquote, possible based on what was being defined by these companies to conform to what that looks like. Gen Z entered the workforce up until COVID and even through COVID in a boom. And so there's a different expectation around different understanding of what authenticity looks like, being unfiltered, showing up for yourself. And I think they've had an amazing impact on Gen Z's had an amazing impact on bringing mental health more into the workplace, because you don't need to hide the things like that about yourself that you're used to. So there's definitely some interesting cultural shifts and impacts, particularly coming from Gen Z on a number of different issues and topics.
Add to what Lauren was saying, I think what she's talking about with kind of these, really formative events shaping the way that Gen Z and millennials engage in the workforce. We see that a lot with social media too. Our data has showed that millennials were more likely than Gen Zers to feel kind of like a FOMO, like a fear of missing out when using social media, and Gen Zers were more likely to feel connected to others. And I think that could even tie back to, the pandemic and being isolated from other people, and Gen Zers growing up with social media being this tool to help them build friendships, build communities with like-minded people, like Lauren was saying, whereas millennials, it was always sort of a bridge to being in person with somebody. Like social media was kind of always a way to create in-person relationships, whereas for Gen Zers, the social media is the connector. And so I don't know, I think that kind of was shown to us during the pandemic as well.
Yeah, and that's similar where I wanted to head, and especially thinking about it through a workforce lens, whether you think about your own employees or you think about, Lauren and I help clients think about how they, engage with their employees and talk to them. You do have a big difference here, to Lauren's point, of a generation that went through a financial crisis, went through 9/11, which even kind of rippled obviously through the workforce as well. And, a Gen Z that's like much more independent, sort of had that COVID experience where they were very much building communities, alone, building communities online, but not, socializing in a workforce. We're still, I think a lot of companies are still down to like 2-3 days a week in the office, maybe. And so there's not that itch or desire for that community again. Do you all see that as kind of a permanent attribute of Gen Z, or is that something that may evolve over time as we move past events like COVID?
That's a really difficult thing to predict.
That's a tough one. I threw a curveball.
The pandemic, I think we're still seeing the kind of after effects from the pandemic. I think it's going to play out over years as opposed to months. It was incredibly disruptive socially. We know that people, doing school remotely, internships were done over Zoom, and all these social experiences were lost as a result. In our survey, we found that no generation were less likely to socialize as teenagers with friends in person than Generation Z. Significantly less than millennials, and much less than Generation X, who happen to be the most likely to engage in those kinds of activities. So I think some of that was likely due to the pandemic. I think was also due to the uptake in social media, replacing some of those in-person activity time. In the future, I think there's going to be a shift in how people use that, right? So I think the amount of time Gen Z spends on social media as a 20-year-old is going to be different as a 30 and a 40-year-old when you have other responsibilities and your relationships may change. But the impact, I think, will carry on.
Let me ask it maybe a different way too. Your most recent survey, it showed that Gen Z and millennials, I think roughly around 6 and 10 for both categories, say the pandemic significantly influenced their life. And that number drops 47 for Gen X, 43 for, I believe that's baby boomers, 37 for the silent generation. I'm interested. Did you get any sense from the research? Do Gen Z and millennials see that as a positive influence, and not necessarily like they enjoyed the pandemic, but it just made them think about how they're going to pursue their life or their career or differently, whereas the older generations, this was a moment, wasn't very fun, but it's past and I'm back to kind of where I was in 2019.
Well, there's no person that is better equipped to answer that than Kelsey.
So we actually asked people to share open-ended responses with us about how the pandemic affected them. And we got about 2,300 of those. And the majority of them there was a mix, but the majority of the people, what we're seeing, the majority of them were pretty negative. They were, like, well, I dropped out of school, or my college was on Zoom, or, something like this. There was definitely a mix where you would see some people say, oh, I got a lot closer with my family because we were all together in the same house doing our various jobs or doing our various school, the things like that. But I do think that Gen Zers are specifically aware of the way that the pandemic impacted their progression socially. I don't think it's just older generations looking at Gen Zers and saying, oh, look, they don't know how to socialize because of the pandemic. Like, Gen Zers themselves are very aware of the way that was stunted based on what we're seeing. Mm-hmm. They know that was a negative thing for them and for their education and things like that.
Yeah. And I think also just for like secondary connections and what that means, like, I forget exactly what the book is, but there's a whole theory on how your new jobs and your partner and a lot of things that happen that you can make happen for yourself in life doesn't come from your first tier of friends. It comes from your second tier, like the network effect. And, you touched earlier upon, return to work and collaboration. I think I don't think we're going back to 5 days a week in the office, but I do think that there will be a recognition of the importance of building your kind of expanded community network relationships with people that are not necessarily exactly in your inner circle, in a way that will pay off later. And I think that is starting to be a driving reason why people are going to come back and return to in-person, all this stuff. I think the other thing, just to circle around, and, we work a lot with, clients that are very on the leading edge of culture, and they're focusing on Gen Alpha. And I think that generation, even younger than Gen Z, is going to be supercharged in many different ways in terms of values, in terms of what being online means, and, less distinction between online and offline versus a completely immersive blended experience, both in when you think about community, when you think about social commerce, when you think about collaborations, all this stuff. And I think that the factor that's going to be supercharged there is just the access to technology, AI, what that means.
I want to jump on something that Lauren said. I was nodding away vigorously as you were talking about the what sociologists call weak social ties, right? These people that are not your immediate friends or family, but they're sort of the next ring out. And there's a lot of research that shows that these folks are really important for connecting you to different social contexts. So whether that's a more diverse context, whether it's helping you find a new job and connecting you to different types of folks in those orbits. I mean, the other thing is it's incredibly important as a sort of broader connective tissue. So when we have really strong, weak social ties, overall social trust is higher. Yeah. And we saw during the pandemic, there was even an Atlantic article written about this, that the pandemic absolutely decimated these relationships, right? Whether it was, the person down the hall that you worked with, that you saw occasionally and chatted with, or a barista that you saw every day, or, the regular bus driver that took you to the office. I mean, these relationships just atrophied, and I don't think they've been replaced. And I think it's one of the reasons you see a number of young workers preferring more time in the office so they can develop these relationships. There's not a lot of other options. if you look at that, we did a study over the summer on this. If you look at where people are sort of forging strong connections and making friendships, the office is a really crucial place for people to do that. And so I think we're going to see, we'll see what employers do, but I think there's going to be some demand for regular interactions that are going to foster those relationships.
Yeah, it's a good point. I was going to tease Lauren a minute ago. I hope our DC staff's not listening, because we're 5 days in the office, and we it's a very light enforcement of that 5 days, but you see the most recent college graduates, our youngest staff, are in there 5 days a week pretty regularly and almost perfect attendance. Whereas, probably myself included at times, the parents, the 30s, the 40-year-olds, they're looking for more flexibility. They're in and out of the office a little bit more. And it's because they have that network already. They have that existing relationship. They've already worked with us and their clients for years. Like, they've got that second, even third tier of network, and they don't quite need to build it in the same way the younger folks do.
I would say too that they have other options, right? Like, so there are other institutions that can help them, right? So if you're a parent, you're connected to a school, which opens up a whole nother way to connect with folks. Particularly if you own a home, you've sort of established yourself in the neighborhood, you're more likely to, engage with your neighbors. So there are advantages that older people have just because of where they're situated, and ways that younger folks, just many of which don't have access to.
Yeah. Dan, you mentioned trust a minute ago, and we talk a lot about, the deterioration of trust among, institutions, politicians, and I think it's interesting. I'm trying to figure out the right way to ask this question, but I do want to ask about what we're seeing today around like the Israel-Palestine conflict. We're seeing a lot of, I think, vocal Gen Z on one side of the issue that's sort of surprising a lot of other generations, if you will think about it that way. How much of that is, driven in your mind by maybe social media and communities just having a louder and bigger platform now? And how much of that maybe is driven by just the lack of trust and people getting out there and voicing things that, because there's not a trusted institution they follow and listen to on some of these bigger issues, or maybe all of the above?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to answer that, but I will say that this is one of the reasons. There are many reasons polls are really important, but one of the reasons is these kind of impressionistic, anecdotal, experiences, events that are shown over social media are not at all representative of what the broader population thinks. And you definitely see this when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war, right? So there's a YouGov poll that I'm looking at right now. So if you look at where 18 to 29-year-olds are, they're much more likely to approve than disapprove of Biden's handling of the situation. That's an impression that you would not get if you just, scrolled through TikTok or looked at Twitter for the most part. But that's where Americans are. And I think there's also not a lot of nuance in 60-second videos. There's a complete lack of context in many cases. So I think, we need to be really careful before reacting to what we're seeing online. Like you may be just shouting at some extremists with no following and then lifting that voice and that perspective up.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also depends on the arena, right? So like this generational divide, that the perceived generational divide around this war right now, the arena right now is on college campuses, in terms of where the activism is. And it's undoubtedly going to spill into other arenas and impact our I think a lot of our a lot of people got through the first wave of it, of figuring out how to talk about it. And now there's a bit of a quiet period, but it is going to continue to have be a catalyst for activism in other arenas too. We'll see where it goes.
And is it fair to say does it foreshadow a bit of a future where, even global conflicts, there won't be necessarily a United States consumer view on issues? You saw that after 9/11, and sure, there were different voices. I don't want to overstate anything, but you saw pretty united. I
also think this is the role of where fractured media and social media plays into.
Yeah, totally.
And that wasn't a thing after 9/11. And I do think that with each generation, there's been stronger and stronger points of views expected and expressed. But I don't know. I think the thing to think about from this perspective and from this kind of divide that we're all feeling, experiencing, observing, is that, there are a lot of good things about social media in terms of a place for empowerment and information and all this stuff. And then where the downside of it in this situation is there's a lot of shouting. To Dan's point, there's a lot of things, nuance missing. There's a lot of, not really speaking to one another. And so, I don't know who the role of this is for, but there is going to be a role for someone to be a convener of respectful and engaging dialogue on really complex topics. And maybe that is some brands and companies, maybe it is other players, but I think we have to redefine what responsible activism is from the perspective of the different, all the different institutions that we work with in terms of understanding, listening, empathy, all these things that seem to have gotten lost from this debate.
I worry too a little bit, and I try not to opine so much, but that there's a sense that social media can replace the kind of institution building and participation that we've seen. There's been a real decline in institutional trust, obviously across the board. Almost any institution you look at, from the military to police to judges and judiciary, Congress and the presidency. If you look at the way young people think about their own country, levels of patriotism, it's far, far lower than previous generations. And I think that's the kind of broader context within which they're making these critiques about U.S. foreign policy. It's that there's already a lack of trust about the federal government's past actions. And I think there's a good reason in some cases to be, a little bit more cynical about the motives and the judgments made in the past. But I think there's a kind of overreaction in some cases. In most cases, these were really, really extraordinarily complicated events. Often cases, there's no one bad guy, one good guy. But I think there's now the pendulum has swung almost too much in the opposite direction, where anything that U.S. does is immediately suspect, and we should rely more on other sources, whether it's other leaders or other sort of U.S. media, to try to make sense of it all. Where I think that's probably not helpful in some ways.
Yeah. Do you see, Dan? You've been studying this for a long time. As you look at the data over time, do you see that, that idea of not trusting certain institutions, change as generations age? Well, I'm oversimplifying here, but the protesters of the 60s are now, grandparents. Do you see that, or is it more permanent kind of attribute of each generation?
There's always, I think, some amount of sort of generational disaffection, right? Where you are born into a culture and a society, and you live under a political system that you didn't create, that you had no hand in affirming, and you may feel really different about that. And I look at the kind of generational cleavages we're seeing now in terms of culture, whether it's sexuality or views on abortion, views on foreign policy, you do see really significant, stark generational divides. And I think it's not a coincidence that our institutions are also aging significantly. Congress is as old as I think it's ever been. And I think it engenders some amount of resentment among the younger generation, thinking, oh, well, you're the things that I care about, climate change, reproductive health, gun violence, are not being addressed, or at least I'm not perceiving them as being addressed in any real manner. So I feel like I'm kind of outside and don't really have a voice in this broader debate that's occurring. And I think it can, lead to people wanting to work outside the system to make change. The interesting thing is this generation is actually pretty politically active. They voted.
Yeah, we've seen that.
2018 election and the 2022 midterm were, historic highs for youth participation. I mean, they're still much lower than older folks, but that's really, I think, really notable.
Yeah, it's a good point. Let me wrap up maybe on a lighter note, but still a serious note. When we think about how companies and brands and even, institutions address generational differences, and we've seen the conflict between generations, the okay boomer memes, and different companies appealing to different parts of that. How deep do you think that is? How much is that contributing to kind of cultural wedges, and any final thoughts on kind of the implications of that on society and institutions going forward?
I'm going to pitch this one to Kelsey. Kelsey, any thoughts?
I do think that kind of what you mentioned about generational conflict is important. I think specifically within families, that's kind of where we see it the most. I mean, Gen Zers are interacting with boomers who are their grandparents. They're not interacting with anyone who isn't their family, who's that much older than them. But I do think that there's sort of the lack of respect that sometimes can come because of that is sort of something to note and be aware of, and maybe even be concerned about. Just because I think that and it's not new for an older generation to think that the youngest generation is lazy. That sentiment has been around for over a century or forever, probably. But I do think that the lack of respect on the other side is sort of growing. And I think a lot of that does have to do with social media and with just like the way that this discourse, like technology has changed so much. And so younger people sort of feel like older people don't really understand them at all, And so I don't know. I do think that there's work to be done there in bridging the gap between the youngest and the oldest generations, just because we would all be wrong to assume that we can't learn anything from the generations that are from us,
Yeah,
I've definitely seen the memes of the young workers making fun of their very well-paid bosses and not knowing how to convert a doc to a PDF.
Yeah.
right. And Lauren, I guess on the flip side, we see a lot of consumer trends of, targeting older audiences, but in a way that makes them younger, hipper, feel like they're part of the generation. Like that's.
Yeah. I mean, there was a great, there's been great memes around, the portrayal of the Golden Girls versus what 60-year-olds look like running marathons today. And so I think there's definitely a changing shift there. I mean, I do think it all comes down to respect and understanding and trying to find these moments of generations coming together in a way that's a bit more unifying. I think we can all aspire to that. And I think the last thing that I'll throw out there that we haven't talked about is that the Olympics are next year, which is totally meant to be a unifying event across the world and across generations. And like the question is, given everything going on, will it be? So hopefully brands can play a role in overcoming some of the divisiveness that might come out in the Olympics and really be a unifying force. So it's my hope.
Yeah. That seems a good place to leave the conversation. We'll do a to be continued next year with the Olympics and have you guys back on for that one. But Dan, Kelsey, thank you so much. I know we kind of jumped all over the place into different points of your research, but thank you for joining and helping us kind of think through this a little bit. We appreciate it.
No, of course.
Same. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you both.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And thanks to all our listeners. Remember, you can like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter @PentaGRP. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis. As always, thanks for listening to What's at Stake.